to tell you one of my favorite short stories ever, and it's The Monkey's Paw. Okay, so in this story, it starts out, it's a really gloomy, dark, rainy night. But inside there's a nice, warm fire in this nice little house. And we have this nice family. It's the White family. We have Mr. White, Mrs. White, and their son Herbert. Now on this particularly gloomy evening, they are waiting for a visitor. The visitor does make it, and we are introduced to Sergeant Major Morris. Now, when Sergeant Major Morris comes in, he starts recounting his war stories and all of these exotic places he's been, which prompts Mr. White into saying, I would love to go to India. I've just always wanted to go to India. I want to go see the temples and the old fakirs. And by the way, Morris, what was that you were telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something? You were saying something about a monkey's paw. Oh, nothing. It was nothing. Just, White, don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. Mrs. White chimes in and says, monkey's paw, really? Tell us about it. What is it? Well, Sergeant Major Morris very reluctantly pulls out this dry, mummified monkey's paw and proceeds to tell the White family that this particular monkey's paw has had a spell put on it by an old fakir, which is like an Indian holy man. And the spell is that 3 men can have 3 wishes. But the spell is to prove a point of messing with fate, that if you do, it will only end in sorrow. Well, Herbert, being the jokester, says, well, Sergeant Major, why don't you get your 3 wishes? Sergeant Major very sullenly replies, I have. Well, Mrs. White, were they granted? Yes, they were. Sergeant Major doesn't offer any other information, but his face goes really pale, and you can tell that whatever happened, he was not wanting to talk about it, and it probably did not end well. Mrs. White asks another question. Well, has anyone else had their wish? You said 3 men. Has anyone else wished? The man before me, replies Sergeant Major Morris. He goes on to say, I don't know what his first 2 wishes were for, but his third was for death. Well, that makes the White family a little uneasy, a little nervous laughter. And Sergeant Major says, that's how I came to have the paw. Well, Mr. White's first thought is, well, then you don't need it. You've had your wishes. Give it to me. Sergeant Major says, no. It's already caused enough trouble as it is. And he throws it in the fire. Mr. White, no! Scoops it out as quick as he can. He wants his 3 wishes. Sergeant Major says, you better just throw it back on the fire. It won't cause anything but harm. And if you keep it, don't blame me for the consequences. The White family jokingly laughs at how stern and serious Sergeant Major is about this monkey's paw. But the evening progresses. Nothing else is said particularly about the monkey's paw. They get a second installment of war stories after dinner, and Sergeant Major Morris leaves. After leaving, Herbert tells his dad, Dad, you should wish to be an emperor. Nobody could boss you around then. And Mr. White says, actually, now that I think about it, I don't think there's anything that I could want, that I would need. I'm actually pretty happy. Herbert says, but if you only wished for 200 pounds, that'd be enough to clear the house. Then you really would have everything. Mr. White says, okay, I'll try. And he holds up the monkey's paw and says, I wish I had 200 pounds. Well, nothing happened. Herbert says, yeah, no money, and I don't think we ever will see any. The White family sits down. It spends a very weird evening. It's unusually silent, and there's not much laughter like there usually is. So Mr. and Mrs. White finally just decide, let's just call it a night and go to bed. Herbert, as they head up the stairs, says, I bet it's going to be on your bed in a big old bag, but there'll be a horrible creature on the wardrobe watching you get your ill-gotten gain. Always making a joke. But he's left downstairs by himself. And as he is, he's watching the fire, and he starts seeing faces in the fire. But then he sees a monkey face so vividly, he reaches to grab some water, throw on the fire, and put it out. He accidentally grabs the monkey's paw, and it startles him. He throws it away, or throws it down, not away, and wipes his hand off quickly, and decides he better go to bed too. Well, the next morning comes, nothing's happened. There's no money, no one's hurt, nothing bad has happened, and they all laugh at just how ridiculous it was that any of them would have believed it in the first place. Well, Herbert gets ready to leave to go to work, and he says, well, don't break into the money before I get back, making a joke of it again. And he heads off to work. Well, the morning goes on, nothing particularly out of the ordinary. But as they sit down, Mr. and Mrs. White, to lunch, she sees a man outside the window. And she notices that this man is very well dressed. And she thinks, 200 pounds, well-dressed man, might have something to do with each other. So she's watching him. 3 times he walks back and forth by the house. But on the 4th time, he stops and resolutely puts his hand on the gate and just goes in. Well, Miss White welcomes him in, is doing the small talk. I'm so sorry. Please excuse the mess. We weren't expecting anyone. Oh, and I'm sorry for my husband's coat. It's usually, when we usually wait, reserved for the garden. But their guest isn't really listening at all. He's very, very distracted. And Mrs. White says, so what can we do for you? This gentleman proceeds to tell them that he's from Ma and Megan's. Immediately, Mrs. White says, what's happened? Is Herbert hurt? Where is he? Mr. White says, now, Mother, just calm down. I'm sure this man did not bring bad news. Now, did you? The gentleman says, I'm sorry. Mrs. White says, is he hurt? Is Herbert hurt? The gentleman says, yes, badly. But he's not in any pain. Mrs. White says, oh, thank goodness. And then she realizes what he means. The gentleman proceeds to tell them that Herbert was caught in a machine and did not survive. And that the company is not going to be responsible, is not going to take liability, but that they would like to compensate the family. Mr. White asks, how much? The gentleman says, 200 pounds. Well, Mrs. White just screams. Mr. White just drops to the floor in a heap. And they bury Herbert 2 miles away from the house. The days go by. There's not much talking. They don't really feel like they have anything left to talk about. Until one night, Mr. White wakes up in the middle of the night and reaches for his wife. But the bed's empty. So he listens, and he can hear her at the window crying. And he says, please come back to bed. You're going to get cold. Mrs. White's reply is, how much colder is it for my son? Mr. White, knowing that he can't really do anything to help her at this moment, and is in his nice warm bed, and his eyes are so heavy, he falls back to sleep. But he is jolted awake with Mrs. White screaming, the paw! The paw! Where's the paw? Mr. White sits bolt upright and says, what? Where? The paw? Huh? Mrs. White says, where's the paw? Go get the paw. Mr. White, realizing what she's talking about, throws the covers back and says, no, it's downstairs, but no. And Mrs. White says, no, we can wish him alive. Mr. White says, listen, when I had to identify him, the only thing that was recognizable about him were his clothes. And if he was that bad then, how much worse would he be now after he has been dead for 10 days? Mrs. White says, I don't care. Do you think I'm going to be scared of the son that I have nursed? Go get the paw. So Mr. White, obligingly, goes down to get the paw. He comes back up. But when he enters the room, the look on Mrs. White's face is very scary. And he is actually afraid of her. She says, wish. He says, no, this is a horrible idea. She says, wish him alive. So Mr. White, to appease his wife, wishes I wish Herbert alive. Well, they wait, and they wait, and they wait until the candles burn down and go out. Mr. White is very relieved and goes to bed. Mrs. White, very disappointed. She goes to bed as well. But in the darkness, Mr. White feels very just oppressed. So he decides he's going to go down and get a candle, like a old-fashioned nightlight. So as he's going down the stairs with his matches, he hears this very faint, almost inaudible knock on the door. He stops, catches his breath, and holds it. Listens very intently, and he hears it again. At that knock, he drops his matches, runs up the stairs, slams the door. Mrs. White, startled awake, says, What was that?" Mr. White's response was, it was a rat. It was just a rat. It was just a rat." But at that moment, there's a louder knock, and Mrs. White screams, "Herbert! Herbert's home, my boy, my boy!" She jumps up and tries to run for the door, but Mr. White tries to stop her. And she says, "Let me by. We have to let Herbert in." Mr. White says, "No, do not let it in." Well, Mrs. White does get around Mr. White, runs down the stairs, runs to the front door, and is unlocking and unlatching the door. All the while, Mr. White is upstairs on the floor, groping around, frantically trying to find the monkey's paw. At the exact moment that Mrs. White is drawing back the last bolt, Mr. White finds the monkey's paw, holds it up, makes his third and final wish, and immediately the knocking ceases. Mr. White hears the front door open, and he hears his wife wail with disappointment. He runs down to be by her side. They look out, nothing. They run out to the gate, look up and down the road, nothing. Nothing was ever the same. We don't really know what Mr. White's last wish was for, but we can guess that much like the first man, his last wish was for death as well.